Mechanics, systems, items, augments, portals, and headliners. This can all be summarized in one word: complexity. This word is a nightmare for players and developers alike, as complex games aren't always amicable. However, learning the intricacies around high complexity games has always been a rewarding challenge for players. Regardless, by Riot's own admission, Set 10 has by far the highest complexity of any TFT set ever. And a question I'd like to ask and then answer is, has Remix Rumble reached the pinnacle of TFT's complexity? Is it all downhill from here, and will every successive set live in the shadow of Set 10? And why do I think portals will not exist in Set 11? Before we get into that, remember to subscribe. Let's start off by talking about the problems with high complexity. Well, initially it can be overwhelming to be presented with so many systems at once, especially if those systems are deep and vast. For example, if we just look at items, you have the ordinary item system, but then you also have those items on crack, or so-called radiant items, then you also have unique artifacts, and lastly, a new support item system that was introduced last set. Learning the breadth and depth of systems like this takes a substantial amount of time and effort, and fully understanding and mastering these interweb systems and how they interact is not simple either. So in a single set, you may never be able to fully grasp its mechanics, especially since their lifespans are much shorter now. There's just so much going on in Set 10 with all of these mechanics, and it makes it increasingly difficult to learn the game. Even if players have already learned the game in a previous set, there have been major overhauls to core mechanics like items. For example, TFT's final mid-set revamped the item system, and Set 10 continued that with the additions of Heartsteel and Red Buff. But as I said, high complexity isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can serve as a rewarding challenge for players to overcome, but that's only if that challenge is presented in an accessible way. In TFT's case it is, but I'll go over that later. Anyway, as long as the set's complexity is met with an equivalent accessibility, then I would personally welcome more complex sets in TFT. But will we ever see a more complex set? Probably, and we can determine this through Mortdog in the Runeterra Reforged Learnings article, where he said, "We believe that TFT's complexity is nearing its ceiling, but that complexity is not going down with our next set. I will say that we are at the complexity level we want to be at now. Now that we've hit this complexity ceiling, it's just time for us to get better at balancing with this raised level of complexity." So, while TFT is reaching its complexity ceiling, the current complexity is what the devs are comfortable with. So this could imply that in due time, when the devs get better and more experience with TFT and its balance, they could try to further raise that ceiling. Although I certainly don't think this will happen anytime soon. If you are not aware, there are 3 different TFT teams, or pods, working on 3 different TFT sets at the same time, and the earliest we will see the efforts of all 3 unique pods is Set 12 or around July 2024. But with Set 13 being made by the same people behind Set 10, like Witchrock, and Set 13 coinciding with the release of Arcane Season 2, there is the possibility that Set 13 will be the set that attempts to go further beyond this complexity threshold. Witchrock in particular has been the lead designer behind some of the most ambitious TFT sets ever, that being Sets 1, 2, 3, 5 and now 10. As the most experienced designer in TFT, Witchrock should be able to construct an even higher complexity set as we've seen with Set 10. But of course, that is assuming that he is the lead designer for Set 13. Regardless, Sets 11 and 12 almost certainly won't have a high complexity, as those will be the first sets for those respective teams. I would assume that those teams don't really want to bite off more than they can chew before they've had enough experience. But I do not know where to draw the line on how many sets will be adequate experience to say, hey, now we can open Pandora's box and attempt to raise that complexity ceiling. But are there ways for Riot to work around that complexity ceiling or even lower it? Well, yeah, there are. Firstly, they can go the route of reining in some mechanics to allocate space for others. Riot have already done this in Set 10, where they reduced the power of portals and removed augments that give emblems and spats to make room for the headliner mechanic. However, if Riot continued to nerf portals, then they would scarcely have any influence in a set, and their power would be non-existent, especially when you compare them to their former glory in Set 9. At that point, what would be the purpose of the entire mechanic? They would just be there to artificially inflate player decisions. And that's why I believe portals will not be in Set 11. Their impact and presence has waned so much that if they were absent in Set 11, I honestly don't think I would notice. Although I probably would notice whatever would replace the first carousel. my impression is that Riot are more than willing to retain wildly popular mechanics like portals in successive sets, but as they don't want them to be evergreen, they slowly fade their existence out. So one method to lower complexity would be to slowly dwindle a mechanic's influence until it's gone entirely. But are you aware of the second method that Riot have been employing more and more often, especially in these recent few sets? That method aims to reduce the perceived complexity of each mechanic by limiting the options presented to the players. For example, even though there are hundreds of augments that each can have distinct playstyles and intricacies, you as a player only need to consider at most 3 at a time. This window trick is really common in TFT now. For example, Radiant Armories only offer a handful of choices, you're only offered a single headliner at a time with a unique ability, and there are always only 3 portal options per game. Riot will likely continue utilizing this trick as these complex mechanics become far more digestible in these smaller portions. And through this trick, a mechanic can be infinitely complex, but that will not matter since you only view it through a small window. And lastly, I want to mention Set 10's introduction of another mechanic that didn't raise the complexity at all. It almost raised the complexities sideways. That mechanic is the music, which brings another dimension to playing TFT, but of course you don't need the music to win the game. Regardless, Riot can add things like this that elicit unique visual or auditory responses in players across the world. This serves as an incredible novel experience without necessarily causing the game to become more complicated. So rather than making TFT more complex, Riot could pursue the route of making each set packaged and presented in a much more artistic manner, so those sets are far more recognizable and distinct from each other. Ultimately, there are numerous strategies that Riot could employ to work around that complexity ceiling. But now, with all things considered, let's once again ask, has TFT hit its complexity ceiling? And the answer to that is yes. But that's for now. We will have to see how complex Set 13 will be when it releases in November next year. At that point, we should be able to gauge how confident and comfortable the dev team are in the set balance, and if that confidence will allow them to pursue even more mechanics in TFT. I believe that Remix Rumble is by far the most well-constructed set we've ever had in TFT, especially considering the sheer number of mechanics and the vastly improved item and augment system. But yeah, now I'll pass the question over to you guys. What do you think? Has TFT truly reached its pinnacle of complexity, or is there still plenty of room to grow? Let me know in the comments, and remember to subscribe. Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me, and as always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.